Okay, we're ready.
Thank you very much. I will now call the meeting of the Planning Commission tonight, Wednesday, February 22nd, to order. It is 6:06 in the evening. If we could start with a call of the roll.
Okay, Commissioner Boatsman,
Present.
Commissioner Curry,
Here.
Commissioner Accuse,
Here.
Commissioner Rashish,
Here.
Commissioner Ragab,
Present.
Vice Chair Murphy,
Present.
and Chair Hubble.
Present.
you.
And I forgot to print out my wonderful script, so I'm going to wing the next portion, which is a portion of the meeting this evening is being brought to you remotely via Zoom. So those who are listening online, thank you and welcome for joining us. For the commissioners online, as we have done in prior meetings, if you'd like to get my attention, the best thing to do is to raise your electronic hand because I can see the yellow box, but if for some reason I am missing you and forgetting to call on you, please just raise your actual hand and make some sort of symbol that catches my attention. So thank you for that. Are there any other disclaimers that I need to make there, Allison, that I forgot?
That pretty much covers it. Thanks.
Great. With that, we will move to the first item on the agenda, which is public appearances. This is the opportunity for anyone to speak to the commission about issues of concern. For those that wish to speak before the commission, please feel free to come up to the podium and you will have 3 minutes to speak and address the audience. And I hear we have a few folks.
Yeah, first we have Audrey Kovner, followed by Anjali Grant, and then Matt Goldbach.
Good evening. This nice cold evening. I'm Audrey Kovner, and just a second, I forgot my first page here. Well, I'll just wing it. I know what it says. Oh, here it is. I live on Mercer Island, and I am a past president of Herzl Near Talmeed and the chair of the Strategic Planning Committee. And I'm here tonight to talk in support of the Herzl Near Talmeed, which I'll refer to as HNT because it's much easier. Their request to add schools to the approved list of building options for Zone B property, which is on the agenda for tonight. My colleague Anjali Grant is our architect, and she's going to go over the details and the analysis because she's way better than I am. I'm just here to provide some context to our situation. So as you can see by the documentation, our request is to amend the city code to be consistent with what we believe is the Mercer Island Comprehensive Plan consistency with respect to building on the Zone B property. The comprehensive plan states that schools are a compatible use. However, the current code describing the zone uses does not include schools, although it does include such things as retail space, theaters, restaurants, gas stations, commercial office space, healthcare services, and a bunch of other things. So just a little history about the property. In 1999, we didn't own, Herzl did not, I'm gonna say we, but we didn't own the property. We were notified that the owner was gonna sell the property and build some commercial building, office building. And since it was directly abutting our property and we didn't think it was gonna be, it could be potentially disruptive to our use, we took out a loan and assessed our members some fees and bought the property at some exorbitant price. Since that time, we have repeatedly discussed and evaluated various options for how to use the land. Although we've had lots of ideas, we were never able to raise enough money to build what we wanted to build. So almost 2 years ago, we started having conversations about sharing the property, with a small Jewish private school that had sold its property in Bellevue and was seeking a new home. And this would give us the needed new schoolroom space we need, as well as a partner to share many of our continuing operating costs, which as a nonprofit, just like everybody else, we could use some help in our costs. So as we begin to accomplish this, we realized the best option would be to build on Barnaby Point, which is our Zone B property. So to achieve this, in September 2021, we submitted a request for a code amendment to add schools to the accepted use in a B zone. In December 2021, the City Council voted to include it on docketing for 2022. Throughout 2022, we asked repeatedly and about when it was going to be heard. And we were told that the department was overwhelmed and managing lots of priorities, and we had no answers. So due to the urgency of the school needing to move out of their site by June 2024, and our uncertainty about how and when the code issue would be addressed, we met with the city planning department to discuss possible options for housing the school on HNT property under existing code. And although the discussion with the city planners was really helpful and based on their information, it looked like it could be possible. When we start to evaluate the costs and the complexities of sharing the spaces, it really isn't the best choice, because it certainly it goes beyond what we expected, and it may not be feasible for our school partner. So just now I've provided that explanation, I also want to speak about two other issues. First, the materials that were sent by the planning department as background for this hearing today offered several options for how we could use our land in numerous alternatives. And Ms. Grant's going to talk more in detail about that, but we didn't suggest any of those or propose any of those. And we're not really at this point prepared to respond to them. Second, as mentioned, we have heard rumors that this request for zoning change is no longer a timely issue, as the school and HNT are no longer talking about sharing property. And I would like to put these rumors to rest as completely untrue. HNT and the school are in active negotiations about creating some possibilities. And in fact, the decision about the zoning change will be a strong positive move in the right direction. So in conclusion, we're here today to ask the Planning Commission to approve the amendment to Zone B to include public and private schools. Thank you for your time and consideration, and we're here to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you.
Anjali Grant is next.
Thank you. My name is Anjali Grant. I'm an architect in Seattle working with HNT to explore options for their property. As Audrey mentioned, the synagogue purchased a parcel of land, Zone B, in order to protect and preserve the residential character of the neighborhood. Herzl would like to be able to develop that parcel in a way that's consistent with the values and character of their institution and compatible with the residential character of the neighborhood. They're currently in very preliminary conversations with one small school. This is an independent inquiry not related to any other development on the island to support Herzl's future. The staff memo circulated with this hearing lists a number of alternatives for the Planning Commission to consider. I would like to address each one in turn. Could you kindly put up the first slide? Alternative A, amend the B zone to allow public and private schools as a permitted use. This would bring the B zone into alignment with the definition of commercial office zoning per the comp plan. Current allowable uses under the current zoning include adult entertainment businesses, restaurants, or preschools, among many others. So this diagram shows you on the upper left is the development potential alternative A. Those boxes are the development potential for each of these alternatives. So you can look at them in terms of their gross area.
Can I ask a question, Dan? Where is A? I don't see A on the drawing.
It's very small. It's the upper left, the B zone. It says 76,000 square feet, development potential alternative A,
Oh,
right
okay.
there.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Alternative B. Does not have a diagram because it doesn't actually have a defined alternative. Add additional conditions or performance standards to mitigate the impacts of these facilities. In our opinion, any changes to existing development standards should be judged on how they mitigate the school use. For example, would a school be more disruptive, larger, or bulkier than, say, a theater, a motel, a restaurant, an adult entertainment venue, or a museum? All of these uses are already allowed in this zone. The potential added conditions are listed as examples include setback requirements, increased right-of-way or side yard setbacks, in my opinion, are not pertinent to the school use. Increased setbacks from residential uses are potentially pertinent to school uses. Again, I would ask whether a school use is more impactful to a residence than a restaurant or a preschool. Lot coverage is not pertinent to a school use. The requirement for a 1/4 acre open space is pertinent to a school use. Alternative C, no change. Alternative C is on the lower left. That would be 76,000 square feet of development potential. That would be no change to the current zoning, would make it more challenging for Herzl to me to find a use that's consistent with the values and character of their institution. Alternative C2, rezoning the B zoned areas to CO. That is on the upper right-hand side. This option would reduce the current development capacity of the site and limit the options available. In addition, the timeline of another docketing process would make the current potential project untenable. Alternative C2, rezoning the B zoned areas to R9.6. That's on the lower right-hand corner there. This option would significantly reduce the current development capacity of the site and impose many more requirements than currently exist. In addition, the timeline of another docketing process would make the current potential project untenable. Could we see the next slide, please? And I just wanted to briefly show you the B zone versus the CO zone, the uses and the development potential for the B zone, which the Herzl currently owns, as you can see, includes many more uses than are allowed in the B zone, and the ones that are overlap are highlighted. That's all I have for today. Thanks so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you.
Next is Matt Goldbach.
Matt Goldbach, Mercer Island. It's not my first time here.
Welcome back, Mr. Goldbach.
I followed the docketing procedures of this amendment from the beginning. And the one thing that was never clear to me is I understood you couldn't have schools in a B zone. And the other aspect of your packet points out that you can, because since the B zone is adjacent or actually connected to the other parcels of the property, which are residential, all they really need to do is apply for a CUP. And that every other school, every private school on Mercer Island is a residential zone. It's governed by a residential zone, including the French American School, which is in a CO, but is measured by residential because it's connected to the JCC, which is in the residential zone. So I think the whole process got started with a misunderstanding, at least to me or the rest of the public, and that is that they couldn't have a school there, when in fact they can. I think the issue is they apparently would like to have more flexibility than any other school on the island if you were to change the conditions. And if you were to change the conditions in the B zone, you'd be changing the conditions in the B zone of all Mercer Island. So there are three particular zoning locations that would be changed. So in my opinion, the B zone should be left alone. And if the Herzl wants to have a school, apply for a CUP like every other school on the island. And I think the neighbors would be quite happy with that. The restrictions in the residential zone are for residential use. And that would be the least impactful to the residents if the school was put in under the residential code. That's all I have. I think that's basically the discussion today is do you change all the zoning on the island for one school, or does the one school go along with everybody else on the island? I'll leave it to you.
That's all I have for people who signed up to speak.
Are there any other members of the audience wishing to speak this evening before You were up, so thank you. Just want to make sure there aren't any others. I see other people in the audience, so, okay. Hearing none, we have none online, Allison.
No.
Great. All right, well, with that, thank you very much, everyone. And we will now move to the next item, which is approval of the minutes from January the 25th, which I think are on the, starting on page 2 and page 3. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
It has been moved by Commissioner Rashish. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Regeb. Are there any corrections, comments, updates that we need to consider? I'm giving Carolyn 1 minute to finish her. Oh, you're good. Okay.
Continue.
All right. Okay, hearing none, all in favor of approval of the minutes, please say aye.
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 Opposed? The minutes are approved 7-0. Thank you very much. Check box. All right, that brings us to item number 2, which was the item related to a number of the public comments. This is ZTR 22-001 relating to the addition of schools as an allowed use in the business zone. And I see Allison Van Gorp coming to the podium. And so I will turn it over to her to walk us through the discussion this evening.
Apparently I'm taller than the last person who used this. Maybe I'm supposed to sit down. Okay. All right, give me a moment to share my screen and get the PowerPoint up. Okay, try that again. It's not working right.
Aren't these hybrid meetings exciting?
Yeah, all of the little boxes that I get to choose from are blank, so I don't know what's going to come up.
It's not open in your. There you go.
But that's not shared on the Zoom, so that's the problem I'm having. Um, I did that, but it's just giving me blanks. I picked a random one and I don't know what it is. So are the people online able to see a PowerPoint presentation?
See a slice of a PowerPoint.
Did that fix it?
That's it.
No. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and start over. I don't know why it's not working. There we go. That looks better. Of course, it's 5 seconds after my IT guy took off.
Always.
All right, how does that look for the Zoom people? Awesome. All right, so the purpose of this tonight is we want to get the Planning Commission's initial input on the preferred alternative for ZTR 22-001, which is a proposed amendment to the development regulations for the business zone. Here's an overview of the process that we'll be using for this legislative review. Tonight, we've got the review of the initial proposal and gathering input from the Planning Commission on a draft code amendment. We'll come back next month on March 22nd for the public hearing. At that point, the Planning Commission can make a recommendation. However, if you need additional time, we could come back at the April meeting for a third touch if there's additional revisions we need to make or things like that. Once the Planning Commission has completed its recommendation, the staff will be doing the SEPA environmental review and notifying Department of Commerce and other state agencies of the proposed amendment. It would then go to City Council review in May or June. They usually do 2 readings. All right, so a little background on this. As we've heard in public comment, Herzl near to Mead submitted a proposal for the docket in 2022 to amend the business zone MICC 1904050 to add public and private schools as a permitted use. The city council did docket this and added it to the 2023 doc. Actually, that's incorrect. That's supposed to say the 2022 docket. I'm sorry. And once it's added to the docket, it doesn't mean that we have to amend the code. We just need to consider it through the legislative process. All right, so let me see if I can move this over a little. It's right in the middle of what I wanted to show. Okay, so there's 3 areas, Mercer Island, that are zoned business. A couple of small areas at the outer wings of town center, and then these few parcels here that cut across the Herzl near to Mead property. As you can see, they're all just sort of south of I-90, near on and off ramps. The zone is, or the regulations in 1904-050, they established the permitted uses within the zone and other development regulations. I'll say that the development standards are very, very minimal for this zone, especially compared to similar commercial zones in Mercer Island. There's really only a 10-foot setback from public right-of-ways. That is really the only standard, that and a height limit. There's no lot coverage, there's no landscaping, nothing else. There's a variety of uses allowed in the business zone, as we saw in public comment. It does include preschools and daycares, but not K through 12 schools. All right, so here's a map of the area right around Herzl near to Mead. I wanted to point out that Herzl owns 4 parcels. It's a little hard to see the boundaries in this map, but one of them is this sort of wedge-shaped section, kind of the northwest quadrant of the property. We saw some diagrams depicting this area in public comment. The other 3 parcels are kind of long and skinny running along here. They all have split zoning, so they're partially in the B zone and partially in the R9.6 zone. And the code does specify with split zoning, in this case, the 9.6 would control. So the development regulations for the residential zone would control those areas of those parcels that are zone B as well as 9.6. So really the B zone only applies to that parcel that's in the northwest corner of the property. And as you can see, there's a mix of zones in this area. There's a fairly large commercial area just to the west. That does include the area with the French American School. Although this lot has split zoning as well, it kind of dips down into the residential zone there. And so that school was permitted under a conditional use permit for the residential zoning because the residential zoning controls on that parcel. There's also another small private school called Yellowwood Academy over in this location. So just to point out, there's a couple of other schools in that area. And then we've got the residential zones to the south. And as I said, the residential zones, private schools are a conditional use, so they can be allowed by a conditional use permit. All right, now I'm going to go over the alternatives for this amendment. Alternative A is what was proposed by Herzl in their docket application. It's quite simple. It would just add public and private schools to the list of permitted uses. No other additional standards were proposed. This would allow schools on that B-zoned Herzl property, as well as the other B-zoned properties in Mercer Island. Because it doesn't include any other additional development standards, potential impacts generated by this use might not be adequately mitigated. So alternative B is kind of the staff proposal. We're suggesting that the Planning Commission should consider adding some additional development standards if you would like to move forward with amending the B zone. Some things to consider include requiring design review, including playfield requirements in terms of the amount or fencing or things like that. Looking at additional setbacks beyond the 10 foot from the right of way that's already in the B zone. You could consider lot coverage or landscaping standards or other things. If there's something you feel is important to consider, it would be great to hear about those tonight. And then alternative C is the no change option. So as I said at the beginning, we're not under any obligation to make an amendment to the code at this time. We're simply here to consider this concept and give it a review. If no change is made, it would prevent development of Herzl's B zone parcel as a school. A private school could be permitted on the split zone parcels through a CUP, but the B zoned parcel could not be permitted for a school. And then I had this sort of twist on alternative C, alternative C2. In the future, the city could consider rezoning this property to either R9.6 or CO, commercial office, to kind of continue the other zoning that's adjacent to the property. As we saw in public comment, those zones have stricter development regulations and dimensional standards. So, that would further constrain what could be built on this property. And it would also give it more consistent standards with other similar facilities in this neighborhood. However, this is not something that we can consider now. It was not included in the item that was previously docketed by the city council. So if this is something that the planning commission would like to recommend, it would need to be added to a future docket and considered once put on the docket for a future year. We have received a few public comments already on this topic. I believe you've all received them via email. A couple from Mr. Thompson and one from Ms. Fletcher. They're fairly lengthy, so I won't give too much detail, but just in summary, I think they were both opposed to changing the allowed uses in the B zone. So the feedback we're requesting tonight is really just some initial direction from the Planning Commission on what you would like to see in the draft code amendment that goes for public hearing next month. If you would like to consider alternative B, I would like to hear your feedback on the types of additional standards and development regulations that you'd like to see included in the draft. This can be fairly high level at this time. We don't need to get into specific numbers or dimensions. You could simply say something like, I'd like to see a larger setback, and the staff can work to pull together some draft language for you to consider next month. So just to go over the timeline one more time. So this will come back for a public hearing on March 22nd. The Planning Commission can make a recommendation at that time. If you would like more time, we can schedule it for a third touch in April, and then it will go to City Council late spring or early summer. All right, that's my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, we will start with questions. Thank you. Let's go to Carolyn Boatsman, and then we'll go to Commissioner Murphy.
So in thinking about this, I kind of like to understand why B doesn't have any development standards to speak of. It's very, very minimal. That would give me some sort of basis for my consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that I don't know is really the true answer. The commercial zones outside of town center, the CO zone and the B zone, appear to be largely untouched from when they originally adopted in the 1960s. Why the B zone was created separate from the CO zone is another good question, because it is just those three small areas. Based on the geography, my guess was that maybe they were intended to be for gas stations, but I really don't know the history and the intent behind why the zone was created, why those uses were selected, why the development standards were so minimal. There really haven't been any development proposals in the B zone in any recent decades. So I don't think the issue has come up where a planning commission or a city council has had to consider whether additional regulations would be appropriate.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Murphy.
Allison, can you scroll back to the slide that has the three areas that are included in the B zone?
There we go.
Yeah, thank you. So as you were just kind of pointing out, those are pretty small, isolated sites. Do we have, or do you have any information with you this evening that would, give an idea of what the dimensions of these areas are?
Oh, like in terms of the acreage or something?
Well, square footage or, 100 feet by 50 feet or. 100
Yeah, I
you know,
don't have that. I imagine some of the folks from Herzl may know the dimensions of their site. I don't know these other ones. They're slightly smaller.
yeah.
I,
Even,
Commissioner
even-
Murphy, I believe just for scale, the one on the upper left, I believe is the small business development that has the pretzel, I always forget the name of it, but they have the great pretzel bagels.
Right.
Yeah.
Sean's, where Sean's Bakery and Cafe is, and I think
Yeah.
there's some other businesses there on that parcel. And then the other one, I believe, is up against,
It's like up the
Island
hill from Island
Crest.
Crest, and I think it's an office building.
yeah, it's right there by the intersection at Island Crest and across from the AGM. I think is it AGM or whatever that design building is, on the upward side of the hill.
Right. So both of those, and I know both of those sites, they're quite small, and the one that HNT is talking about is also quite small. Have you done any mock-ups or diagrams that would indicate what your proposal B would how it would affect those sites with the setbacks?
We have not. I think I wanted to get feedback from the commission in terms of if you do want to add additional setbacks, what, generally you're thinking there. Like, I know in the CO zone, some of them are quite large, like 45, 50 feet. So like, are we talking about that or are we talking about 10 feet? I need to get an idea of how
Well,
much we're thinking.
Yeah, and what I was getting at was that if you're talking about 40 or 50 foot setbacks, you just basically eliminate the use of that property.
Yeah, which
so
clearly
I'm
could
not
be
sure.
problematic.
How realistic talking about setbacks of that magnitude is.
Yeah. I think from what we saw in public comment, for one thing, and just the size of the other two B zone properties, I think large setbacks could definitely be problematic.
I saw, I believe, Kate, Commissioner Eckes, you had your hand up.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Let me figure out how to lower my hand here. So I had a similar question to Carolyn about the origin of the B and C O zones. It seems like there's so much overlap as was shared in the public comments. There's really seems to be no rhyme or reason to the splitting. And I'm curious if there's ever been a proposal before the council to just combine them. And I understand that would be a different docket item for a different day.
To combine the CO and the B zones.
Yeah, because it doesn't, especially with those two commercial use properties, those would blend very easily into the CO zone. There are already large buildings that are commercial use on those properties. So it would be, it wouldn't be a problem for those, but it just, this one lot over here, it's kind of doesn't make any sense given the actual use of the properties. And I don't think the temple's going anywhere. So I guess my question is, has the council in the past considered eliminating the B zone? And if not, why not?
I do not think that's been considered, certainly not in recent years.
Okay. Because in my opinion, that would be the most logical thing to do. Although I understand it doesn't meet the requirements, we do have ways in, we do have ways in our code that we can kind of grandfather things in, you know, non-conforming uses, things like that. There are procedures for allowing non-conforming uses to exist. And I'm sure some of the other buildings in the commercial zones.
Yeah, I'm sure there's other buildings that predated when that zoning was created.
Yeah, I think it just creates a lot of confusion to have that, especially since two of the parcels already mostly conform to the commercial zone. It's just confusing to have it all together. So it sounds like it hasn't been considered before, which I find sort of interesting. So is there, I'd be curious too, as from the comments that you have, like what's the consequence to the property owner if the B zone stays? I mean, it seems like it's, like Mr. Goldbach was saying, there's a lot of more potential with the B zone. I'm not really tracking what the problem is completely. I just don't understand the zone altogether. It just doesn't make any sense. The B zone's existence. Can someone that's been on the planning commission for a while, maybe the chair or the vice chair, respond to that?
Yeah, I was going to offer some comments, but I'll make sure everyone else has. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a complete answer to that question, other than the fact that in my 7 years of being here, there are a number of very long-standing legacy decisions that were made when the city incorporated in what's late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, 1960s.
That frankly were of an era that I would say lacked sophistication, or maybe a broader knowledge of what we would consider more modern zoning practices. Zoning was at that time much more chopped up and piecemeal than it is now. So I actually have the same question, which is why in the world would 3 small parcels like this exist? The only thing I can think of is that over time, I do know I believe there were some other B parcels that we reconsidered being, or that we've rezoned. I think even the south end, has it always been?
I don't
Like
know if
even
it's,
going back into the 90s?
I think the PBZ may have been put in place when the South End Shopping Center was redeveloped, but
Yeah, so there's
positive about
some
that.
longer history that, like, I think in the 90s, there was a big redo of the
Yeah.
town center plan was adopted, and a number of other things where I think there were some updates
Yeah.
that may have just failed to capture some of these smaller
Yeah.
parcels. I don't have any detail, and I don't
think
know how
that's
correct.
true from the little bit of research I've done, and just the way things are written, the B zone appears to be very old. There's similar other zone, like the MF zones in the city are also very untouched and
Yeah.
ancient language.
And what makes me think that that's the case is the 2 properties that are developed in the B zone are of the era that they were around in the 60s. Or about that time. And the B zone that's in question here is for the most part actually undeveloped.
Yeah.
So it has the weird flag shape that spits off of the CO zone there. But so it lends me to believe that all of this is just legacy from that perspective. I will say that there have been a couple of occasions where at least I've been party to conversations on both the design commission and the planning commission in talking about holistically looking at the zoning of the city, and the councils at the time, and I would probably venture to guess even the council of today, have been completely unwilling to undergo that exercise. I personally think it would warrant looking at the city in its entirety and trying to update a number of these sorts of inconsistencies, but it's just not been, there has not been the appetite to do that. A couple of other questions for you then, Allison, since I have the floor. One point of clarification in looking at the map, I believe, because I was on the commission when we did this, the current schools are actually in no longer in a residential zone. They're in a zone that was created called a public facility zone, I believe.
There's a
that-
public institution zone that public schools are in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously private schools not, but all of the actual large schools are part of that public institution zone that was created. And I know because we spent months going over during the middle school redevelopment, what all of those updated development regulations would and should look like. And I do remember at the time, the exclusion of the other schools from that zone for the very point that large public institutions have very different needs, demands, and design regulations that have to exist compared to the smaller schools. So I do remember, at least at that time, there was a intention to exclude them from that public institution zone, just because the needs are different and we were not trying to address those at the time. So that's my piece of history there. And then as far as the school similar to the French American school, I think you mentioned that's under a conditional use permit, and there are a few other schools similar to this on the island. Are there any specific regulations in the residential zone related to schools or churches or those sorts of things, or are they all regulated by a conditional use?
There are
Permits.
some regulations in the residential zone related to schools. Those were included in the staff memo in the section under Herzl to Mead.
Yeah. Okay. But can they be overridden by the conditional use permit, or are they?
They need to comply with those conditions as a part of their conditional use permit. And it requires design review. So the design commission would need to make sure that they're meeting those conditions as part of their review.
Got it. But those same conditions do not exist in the CO zone, only in the residential zone.
Correct. The CO zone has just one basic requirement, which is for a 1/4 acre playfield.
Okay. All right. Let me go to Victor and.
So in reading the packet, I had the same read that Mr. Goldbach had, which was, it seemed like the path for this was conditional use permit. But you said something in the talk track on this slide that indicated that that may not be the case. Is that?
So there's
you
two
explain
different
that?
zones that cover Herzl's property. So there's a parcel in this corner, this upper left corner, that's completely in the B zone. And so if we don't change the permitted uses in the B zone, that part of the property cannot be developed with a school. The other parts of the
Even,
property.
sorry to interrupt, even with a conditional use permit.
Correct. The conditional use permit doesn't like overrule the development regulations that are in place. It would need to comply with them.
Okay.
Adam.
I guess I have two questions. I think they're a little more procedural. I was reading the docket request form, and that was adding it, adding that use to the B zone. And then we're presented with this little extension of it as that option B of like B zone with restrictions. That wasn't requested, right? So why is C2 off the table? Like that seems to me, independent of any procedural restriction, like that seems like a reasonable one, right? R 9.6 is the land around, that would maintain character. It's got standards that are consistent with all the other schools. So why are we given an option of what was asked plus restrictions, but not something that seems more reasonable? It seems like, this B is like a thorn in
Well,
the side that's slowly being removed.
What the code says is that when something's docketed, it needs to go through legislative review, and the planning commission has the option to either recommend that we do that proposal with revisions, or we don't do it.
But we can't suggest.
We can't consider something that is altogether different or separate from what was proposed in the docket. So what was proposed was an amendment to the B zone. So really the bookends are on that code section 19-14050 That's the development regulations for the B zone. Rezoning is a completely different thing.
Okay, and the other procedural question is, since we have, people here from HN, the three-letter acronym, sorry.
HNT.
Little spaced out. May I ask a question?
Yeah, well, what's the nature of the question?
I guess why was the request made to just add, or, add a use to the B zone instead of to rezone as a R 9.6? Like what is the subtlety there?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't want to break a rule. I'm curious.
well, I mean, what's that?
Okay, it just restricts the.
Yeah, I mean, that
Okay.
that was the way I
Okay.
interpreted the presentation as well. I mean, we can. I think it's a good if you feel like you need to follow up on it after the break.
I guess,
mean,
yeah, from the picture. Okay,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think the bottom line is the other zones are more restrictive.
Okay.
And I think there's kind of a tension there in that, this city may want some additional development regulations, but as Commissioner Murphy pointed out, if we look to the more restrictive end of things, it may completely make these parcels undevelopable. And
Okay.
I don't think our city attorney would recommend that.
Okay. Thanks.
Carolyn, I'll come back to you. I know you had your hand up.
So I have several
And then-
questions that are brief that are
And then I'll go to you, Kate. Sorry, I just want to acknowledge I saw your hand.
several brief questions, mostly to just confirm my understanding. So option B, if that changed, if we recommended that and it were to be approved, that would apply to all B properties.
That's correct.
Okay, all right, thanks. And then the idea of rezoning to 9.6 or CO, that would not affect other B properties, right? If you, it's
Correct.
just that
If you
one
just
parcel.
constrained it to this area
Okay.
that's on the map right now, that's
Okay.
correct.
And then when we talk about using these different several parcels on the HNT property and setbacks, I'm a little confused. Like if they were combining parcels and building a larger development that overlapped several lots, then the setbacks are just from the perimeter of the structure, and that can be done, right? So
You can
each lot doesn't have
combine
its own
parcels,
setbacks.
you'd probably need to do a boundary line adjustment.
Oh.
It's a more complicated process.
Okay, so I'm just wondering how much of their property would end up being used for setbacks, so you combine lots is the answer, it sounds like.
It would be very complicated in this
Mhm.
case because of the split zoning. If they were to combine lots, then I think the R 9.6 zoning would sort of take over.
Anjali. Thanks.
That's the chair's
Um,
pleasure.
Yeah, come to the microphone. I know the two commissioners have referenced it, and I'll just
Let
get
me
your.
make sure it's turned on.
I just want to clarify that the R 9.6 zone has a development cap of 10,000 square feet gross floor area. So we are completely maxed out under R 9.6. No one would want to build a school that has a 10,000 square foot gross floor area cap. That is very small. That is the quote mega house ordinance.
And I'd like to
Thank
see
you.
if that's the same, that Allison agrees with that, concurs with that. Because I thought that was just for residential construction.
I think I do agree with that. I'd need to review it again to refresh my memory, but I know this has come up with other larger non-residential facilities that are located in our zones.
Which gets back to the whole debate we had 5 years ago around creating a separate zone for non-residential facilities that we could have different standards for these things. But
Correct.
I'll get off my soapbox. Commissioner Ekus, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you. I have 3 questions. I think they're short. Do you want me to ask them all together or one at a time?
Go ahead and list them off. Are they for Allison?
Yep.
Yeah. Would you prefer them all at once, Allison?
Why don't you ask them all at once, and then I might ask you to repeat if I need you to remind me.
All right. Number 1 is in reading the comments, I noted that Daniel Thompson challenged the legality of changing just the allowed uses in a zone. Has the city attorney reviewed the code and indicated that we are allowed to change only the allowed use of the B zone? Go ahead and answer.
Okay. The city attorney has not reviewed that at this time. From the CPD staff perspective, we believe we can change the allowed uses or other development regulations for the zone.
Okay, that's good to know because I think it comes into our next item as well. Question number 2 is in terms of the restrictions for only one use in the B zone. I'm like, would the restrictions only apply to one use in the B zone, or can it be that you say, and I'm thinking again of our next agenda item, it's got all those different shoreline uses, and it says what type of permitting process you have to do. Could the B zone be amended that if you did put schools in there, you would have to get a conditional use permit?
Yes, that's a possibility.
That's a possibility. Okay, and then my final, I guess it's a comment. Are we commenting on whether we like this or not at this point?
That's fine to give initial feedback.
Okay, so my initial feedback is that it sounds like it's a tremendous lift to consider the B and CO zones, and it's a timing issue as well for the proponent of the revision. So I don't, given that none of us fully understand the intent of the B versus C and O zones, it seems a little arbitrary what's on those lists, one versus the other. So I think I could get behind supporting the proposal. However, I definitely think it would need to have some revisions, including requiring a conditional use permit and setbacks. That's all. That wasn't a question, a comment.
Thank you, Kate. Commissioner Curry, you're the only person that hasn't raised their hand. If just want to make sure you have a chance to ask any questions if you have any.
Not necessarily. I'm just trying to absorb everything that's going on, and I do agree that some of this probably needs to be dove into a little bit further, just to get a better understanding and around the whole scope. But I would ask, is there any kind of precedent that would help give this color or add a little bit more meat to it that here on the island over the last several years? And then what would be the impacts of converting this piece of property so that they could build a school? Are there litigation type impacts that we would see from other business owners or other property owners here on the island or whatever, right? Are we setting a precedent by doing this kind of deal?
Well, I mean, the city has amended development regulations in the town center zone and the residential zones in the time that I've worked here over the last 8 years. So, we certainly do make changes to development regulations from time to time when it's deemed appropriate by the city council. I think, any decision the city makes can be subject to an appeal. That's not exactly the same as litigation, but it would be a legal process with a cost to it.
I think Commissioner Curry, if I can just add and go back to my previous comment, this is exactly the exercise that we went through for the Mercer Island School District when they came to us and asked for some changes to the way that their properties were being regulated under the R6 zone. And we went very joyously into trying to help them find a solution so that they could build schools that were adequate. And so I don't see this as having any incongruency with the exercise that we've done in the past for other.
Perhaps another relevant example is there was a time a couple of years ago when a religious institution came to the city and said, gosh, we really need to be able to build a residence for our minister because the housing on Mercer Island is just not affordable. And we aren't able to pay the rent to have him live here. And we'd like to build a home on our property. But there were some issues with some of the development regulations relating to stormwater that weren't going to allow that to happen. And we actually did amend the zone so that they could go forward with that project.
I forgot about that. Did I answer your question, Commissioner Cree? Great. All right, so why don't we, I see one hand. I'm going to just do another round robin for any last questions and then any comments that you might have for Allison for direction. Again, we're not looking for a decision or even consensus, frankly, but unless you're looking for consensus about what you want, what
I mean,
the
I think
group-
if there's specific things you would like to see brought back next time, I'd like to see some consensus around what those are. We don't need specific details, but like, for example, if you'd like an analysis of what type of setback might be appropriate or, you know, kind of looking at the dimensions and what would fit, that would be something we could do.
Okay. So I'll start with you, Carolyn, since you raised your hand, and then I'm going to go around to everyone else.
This, comment that structures in the 9.6 are limited to 10,000 square feet gross floor area is really exercising my brain on this particular matter. So if we were to change the B zone, that doesn't affect the development potential of the split properties, right? Because they're still subject to 9.6.
That's correct.
So changing the B zone only affects what happens with the parcel that is all B, right?
Yep, just this parcel
Okay.
here, plus the two other areas near town center.
Okay. Thank you.
Carolyn, did you have any either direction or commentary on sort of where what you would like staff to come back with next week? I can also give you more time
Sure,
if you want to
sure.
think.
This is a very complicated matter, but it seems to me that adding development standards to the B zone is the best way to go. I'm afraid, why don't you take somebody else first and I will try to figure out explaining why I feel that way.
All right, I'll come back. Victor, do you have any
Questions? Are we still
questions,
on
comments? You can do either.
So my question, has there been a cup filed for this?
No. There's been a pre-application meeting, but that's really just for informational purposes. There's been no applications filed.
How long does a cup take?
I actually don't know. We haven't done one in the time I've been here. But I would estimate it'd be several months.
Yeah. So several months. And everything, several months starting when? Like
From-
all this process needs to play out, or could a cup be filed right now?
I think, if Hertzl wanted to apply for a cup, they could come in and do that at any time they wanted to. And then the city would proceed with reviewing that application.
With the exception that the use is not permitted in the zone, so it would be.
Yeah, I mean,
an
they can't
elementary
apply for a
exercise, right?
cup on the B zone because there's no conditional uses in those development regulations. But if they wanted to apply for a cup to do something on the residential part of the property, they could do that.
Can you apply for a variance, or is variance the same thing as a cup?
They're different things. Our code is very restrictive in terms of what kinds of variances are allowed. You can get a variance from dimensional standards if it would not otherwise allow you to develop the property. And I think it specifically refers to being able to build a single family home on the property. So, if the setbacks or like say a critical areas provision, like a stream buffer, would prevent you from building a house, you could ask for a variance to that standard to reduce the size of the setback or the buffer to allow you to build. However, I don't think there's any dimensional standards that are causing an issue with the B zone property here. So I'm not sure that a variance would be that it would be eligible for a variance.
So several months for a cup. The changes that we're talking about here, whether it's option A or option B, how long does that take? That.
Well, we would need to
and
complete,
let's include litigation and.
we'd need to complete the planning commission review, which is going to be at least another month. It would need to go through, we need to do the SEPA checklist and make a determination, notify the state agencies. We can ask for expedited review from the Department of Commerce. And then it could go to council. So that could be done in about a month. And then it would go to council for their 2 reviews, which would probably take 1 to 2 months. So I think all of that could be finished by summer, by June or July. And then, you know, if someone appeals it, that goes through a whole nother thing. I can't really predict the exact timing of an appeal because that really depends on, you know, the hearing examiner and when that can get scheduled and things like that.
Let me go to Commissioner Murphy. Do you have any additional questions or just comments on the options?
No, I think having some more dimensional information would be very helpful to try to understand how we might put restrictions on development. Allison, I have one question. Looking at the map of that area, with the split parcel, particularly the one at the bottom left, I would assume that they could do a boundary line adjustment to make that a B parcel.
So you're talking about this right here.
Yes. That they could, where the diagonal is.
They could adjust the boundary to follow that diagonal.
Correct.
I think that would probably be possible.
Okay. So they could have a slightly larger B parcel, and they could theoretically do the same, but they've got a building in the way. So that's probably not very practical.
Yeah, it would make this building really non-conforming and that might be a problem.
Yeah. So the most that they could do is maybe draw that diagonal, shift that all into the B zone. But we're really still looking at a very small.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I mean, we'd have to look at this is a big parking lot. So to make sure
Right.
they still have enough parking for the synagogue and things like that. But it's possible.
yeah. So at the end of the day, you know, we're talking about a very small triangle in there.
Mhm.
Okay.
Let me, I saw Victor first, and I'll come to you, Carolyn.
So if there's a lot line adjustment, they're then adjacent to a residential zone, is that correct?
Yeah. Though, I mean, the R9.6 is what controls for this whole property. So how that's considered in terms of adjacency is a good question.
And just, and I'm sorry if I'm being a little slow on this. What we're talking about is that piece of that wedge-shaped piece that has the B on it.
Yeah, you can see a faint line there and there,
Okay, and where's the building?
right over here. That's the main synagogue building. And then there's a couple smaller buildings off to the side over here.
And so if they were to apply for a cup, where exactly would that, where would they be applying for?
So
It's that little, that,
everything that's not in this little triangle. So this big parking lot, and then the existing buildings down over to the waterfront.
And that is not zone B.
They're all split zoned, but the code dictates that our 9.6 would control, like the more restrictive zones supersede.
Carolyn?
Yeah, so we've been talking quite a bit about what can be, what development can be done in various zoning designations. But it's important also to look back at what the original proposal was by HNT, which was just to ask, to propose that a school be allowed in the B zone. And I'm in favor of that because the comp plan indicates that schools should be allowed in that zone. So I think that's something I'm basically in agreement with. And then also, if schools are allowed in the commercial office, why not in B? I mean, I'm in favor of that, in favor of allowing them in B for that reason as well. However, I do think that the development standards in B are insufficient. So I do think that we should have some development standards added to B. And this is a great opportunity to do it. There's just 3 small pieces of property on Mercer Island that have this zone. And this is going to come up again when somebody wants to develop in those zones. And this is a perfect opportunity now to address this sort of dinosaur zone that doesn't have any development standards to speak of. So I would agree with adding some standards to it that are somewhat similar or consistent with what a school has to do that's built in a CO zone. So I don't think I probably need to say anything more specific about that, but it's, setbacks and heights and lot coverage and all of the above. I would like to see some things coming back that we could review that would be very specific in that regard.
Okay.
Thank you.
Allison, in the definition of schools, I know we have the other private school. It wasn't Bright Horizons. What's the one that's over in the
Yellowwood Academy.
Yellowwood Academy? So that's kind of more of like a tutoring type school. I don't know as if they have a full-time program there or not, but I know.
I understand that it's full-time, but it's more of a one-on-one or a small classroom situation.
Yeah. And I ask that because if I think about the other 2 parcels, so some of the public comment has been around the unintended consequences of opening up Pandora's box for these other 2 parcels. I'll call it the Sean's Bakery parcel. If that landowner is smart, they'd get an application in today if there's no regulations governing what can be done on that property, because that gives them, I think they've got a great opportunity to build something great. Aside from the height restrictions, the other parcel I don't ever see redeveloping if it's the office space parcel that I believe it is, looking at the map and that you've mentioned. But I could, however, see that changing a use into something that's more like Yellowwood Academy, right, where you have a lot of these either trade programs or tutoring programs. I mean, those are the sorts of things that we actually do see and have a bit of a demand for on the island. But I'm not sure we're ever going to see it, at least in my lifetime, redeveloped, given just the way that it's already developed.
Mm-hmm.
So aside, taking off the table all of the problems I have with the B zone just generally existing within the current zoning map, personally, I'm on the direction of it's a compatible use for what's happening in that area. It is unfortunate that zone is set up the way it is. And we have some responsible groups that are looking to provide another essential service for the island. We do have a dearth of education opportunities on the island. And we know that this island prides itself on the investments that it makes in education. So to me, it's an absolutely compatible use in whatever zone it's called. I'm in agreement that we should probably figure out what appropriate guidelines we should have in place. I'm sure there are some direction that we can look at to build something reasonable that would make this parcel usable in the way that it is intended. So those are my 2 cents on this. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of details and questions that come up with all of this. I find it surprising to hear from a community that favors education in the way that they do, and for quite literally a single parcel that exists in this situation to be seeing such a I don't know, tactical outcry over a bunch of I don't know, procedural things that to me just I don't know, scream that there's something else going on. But from my perspective, I think looking at the possibility of opening this up with some as a accepted use in the zone with some additional requirements would be a good idea, barring the details of those coming forward. Let me go to you, Adam, and then I'll go back to the other commissioners online.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I share everyone else's opinion that, yeah, like, you know, schools are good, to put it not very eloquently. That, you know, I guess what I'm kind of looking at it from is surrounding zoning. And maybe I'm leaning more toward from not in the let's allow schools and see what guidelines will add, but it's like, let's allow schools and see what of those R 9.6 regulations are deal killers and consider removing. So that's kind of what I'm leaning towards. I did do a little looking, and this could be completely wrong. I looked at like the 1965 zoning, and there were a few B zones, and they open up with any use permitted to R, in this case, 8.4, provided said uses comply with area, frontage, and setback regulations, and then a few additional things. So it seems like it's follow residential guidelines, and we can add a few neighborhood businesses or something. Now, this may be the wrong zone. So that's kind of what's making me lean towards, yes, I would like to support a school, but I wouldn't feel confident in my ability to assign restrictions additively. I would rather subtract from a known collection of them. So that's kind of how I'm reading this.
I'll note the lovely reference I was looking over his shoulder to hand laundries as an acceptable use. So we know how long that document's been around. Okay, let me go back. Commissioner Murphy, I see your hands.
Yeah, one thought following up on what you were saying, Dan, and that is, Allison, would it be possible when you're looking at coming up with different features or development standards, would it be possible for you to work with HNT and their architect to try to come up with something that actually is going to work, and that would also have more broader appeal or more broader application potentially? But I think the one question, we talked about development standards with the B zone. We need to figure out, are we talking about development standards writ large or development standards for only schools? So that's a question that has to be addressed. But assuming we're dealing primarily with the school issue, which is what is on our plate, I would hope that staff could work with HNT and, formulating a meaningful set of options for us to look at as far as, regulations.
Sure, I think that's possible. I I've heard from some of the other commissioners, they'd like to see an analysis, I think, of some of the existing zoning provisions and other or development regulations in other zones. Perhaps I can do kind of a side-by-side analysis of the provisions that would apply to a school in the R zones and in the CO zones. I think we might want to give some special consideration to setbacks, as you previously mentioned, and I think that might be an area where it would make sense to work with HNT to see how that would impact the potential, the development potential on the site and what they're looking to do.
My only comment about setbacks, by the way, is that one half of this property is abutting a freeway, and what in the end, I understand, I've been around long enough to understand the broadly what the necessity and appropriateness of setbacks are. But in this case, we should certainly be just thinking about the appropriateness of the application of those in this specific spot, because there is actually no abutting property other than their own and the freeway. So who are we protecting with setbacks would be an interesting question to ask. Commissioner Acuse, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, just I think you're round robining to get our final comments. So
Yep.
let's see, I wrote them down. So I was just as a final comment, just kind of on the spirit of the regulations, and I was in reading the comment from the proponent related to substantial relation to public health, safety, or welfare. You know, I think prior SJCC information, at least that I could find online, I know it's dated, estimated the Jewish population of Mercer Island something like 20%, but we only have seats for 50 Jewish students on the island in Jewish schools. And that seems to be like a bit of a disconnect to me. And the reason that kind of stands out to me is because I've got kids in the schools, and despite the efforts of the school district, there are children in our community that are still terrorized by students. I would assume of the island's religious majority in our public schools. There's swastikas written on walls. There are, you know, kids veiling bomb threats. The amount of security the J has is just incredible. So I think that there are legitimate safety concerns for these students, and I think they deserve to have a choice, given that kind of terror that it's brought into the schools. In terms of the staff review, it would be great if you could request the city attorney, if it's not like a huge ask, if we are indeed allowed to change allowed use of the B zone without a broader zoning process. And then again, within that, just apply restrictions on only one of the allowed uses. And then just highlighting the other stuff, I would support this, that schools be allowed in B zones, but only if there was a conditional use permit. And would love to see research on potential standards, including setbacks and landscaping, similar to those developed for the PI zone, the R zone, and the CO zone. So I'd love to include that PI because it sounds like a lot of thought has already gone into that. That's all I have. Thanks.
And I think last, Commissioner Curry, did you have any parting comments? Shake your head, no. Okay. Allison, do you have sufficient direction? I've heard two things sort of thematically. One was the standards. If we do come forward with any additional standards, just some either clarification or recommendations on how we should approach that versus just for that use. And there's plenty of we do that in plenty of other zones for uses versus I think the legal term Commissioner Murphy used was writ large. And then the conditional use has come up by a number of people, and whether or not we would want to apply that in this case. If we do allow the use in that zone, then how or if we would want to use a conditional use permit, allow it as a conditional use, not as a permitted use, right. As with the way we would do it from a structural perspective. And then the third one that we haven't talked about, but I do think in the list of potential regulations is traffic mitigation. That's not one, we talked about it a lot when we were talking about some other projects in that
Mhm.
area, but specific to that intersection and those areas, I do think it warrants having some sort of at least conversation around if there are any performance standards that need to exist.
Okay. Great. So I think my marching orders are to prepare an analysis of how schools are regulated in the existing 3 zones, R, CO, and PI. Make some recommendations around potential standards for things including setbacks, landscaping, play fields. Potentially also a recommendation about whether schools should be a permitted use or a conditional use, and kind of pros and cons perhaps around how those two might work. And also touch base on the legality of all this and make sure we're on solid ground there.
That sounds like a good summary to me. I'm seeing a number of nodded heads. So great.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who came to talk on that matter. And we will bring this back. I think, Allison, you said next month.
Yes, the
Or was it
public hearing
April?
will be next month on March
Next month.
22nd.
Great. Thank you very much. And then before we move to item number 3, why don't I recommend we take a quick 10-minute recess. We will come back at 7:25 right now. We'll come back at 7:35 in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
That's approved by the planning commission, so perhaps friends or.
Oh, this one is the beach club. All right, we're ready to go whenever you are.
Excellent. I see Commissioner Murphy and Commissioner Acuse back. Hopefully Commissioner Murphy, sorry, Commissioner Murphy. No, you're there. Curry is who we're missing. It's too many Y and names ending in Y. All right, thank you, everyone. That brings us to item 3, ZTR 23-001. Allowing an S cup for review of a marina and swim facilities with the beach club on the south end. And I see we have someone, I can't see the name because of the captions, but I know we have members of staff here to address the commission. So
yes, thank
welcome.
you. Just give me 1 second. All right, can everyone see that?
We can. And Molly, if you want to introduce yourself, I think this is the first time you've been in front of the commission. So if you want to say hello and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Yeah, so my name is Molly McGuire. I'm a planner here at the city. I've been here for a little over a year now, so it's nice to meet everyone. Today, I'll be introducing zoning text revision 23-001 for an amendment to shoreline regulations for marina and swim facilities in the city's shoreline master program. There it goes. So the purpose of this presentation is to get the Planning Commission's input on the preferred alternative for the proposed amendment. And here we are at in the process. During this meeting, we'll do an initial review of the proposal and gather input from the Planning Commission on the draft code amendment and alternatives. And then the next meeting on March 22nd will be a joint public hearing with the Department of Ecology, which we hope to get a recommendation from the Planning Commission. And then after that, the draft code amendment will be submitted to the Department of Ecology for their initial determination of consistency before it goes to City Council. So some background on the Shoreline Master Program for those that might not be as familiar. The SMP is what we use to regulate uses and development within the shoreline jurisdiction, which is 200 feet landward from the ordinary high water mark. And cities are required to adopt an SMP under the Washington Shoreline Management Act. The regulations in the SMP must be consistent with state standards, so any amendment to the SMP will be reviewed by the Department of Ecology for consistency with the SMA. And now for some background on the docket request for the purpose of this presentation. The Mercer Island Beach Club submitted a proposed amendment to the SMP during the 2022 docket, which was added to the 2023 docket by City Council. And then keep in mind that adding an amendment to the docket does not require the city to amend the docket as proposed. It can be revised or not amended at all as well. So the amendment that was proposed by the Mercer Island Beach Club is to revise the footnote in Mercer Island City Code 1913-040 Table B, which regulates shoreline uses waterward of the ordinary high water mark. So the current footnote reads, a use not listed in this table is not permitted within shorelands. The Beach Club has planned to substantially update and reconfigure their moorage and swimming dock facilities. However, in a pre-application meeting, it was determined that the proposal could not move forward under the current code, since the SMP does not include non-residential or large moorage facilities as an allowed use due to this footnote. So standards for residential docks and public access piers don't necessarily make sense to apply to private marina facilities like the Beach Club due to size limitations and access requirements. Sorry, let me go back. The Beach Club's proposal would allow for existing private clubs or residential communities serving more than 10 families to use a shoreline conditional use permit for the redevelopment of its moorage facilities. So in these next slides, I'll go over the proposed alternatives.
Sorry, Molly.
Oh, go ahead.
My apologies. I had a quick request. If you wouldn't mind just going a little bit slower because we're trying to follow
Okay.
along on the screen and it's at a distance. So if you could just move a little slower, that'd be great.
Yep, sorry about that.
No worries.
So in these next slides, I'll go over the proposed alternatives, benefits and drawbacks. And then at the end of these slides, I'll ask for some feedback from the Planning Commission regarding direction for the proposed draft amendment to take to the public hearing next month. All right, so alternative A is to amend the footnote in MICC 1913-040 Table B as proposed by the Mercer Island Beach Club, which would read, a use not listed in this table is not permitted within shorelands, provided, however, that this footnote does not preclude any existing private club or residential community serving more than 10 families from using a shoreline conditional use permit process for redevelopment of its moorage facilities, floating platforms, mooring piles, diving boards and diving platforms, associated swim areas, and other accessory uses, all where the applicable development standards are to be determined on a case-by-case basis. Sorry, that was a long one. The benefit to this amendment is that it would allow existing private clubs or residential communities to redevelop their facilities through the conditional use permit process, which is a process that has already been developed by state law. But some drawbacks are that it does not contain language that is consistent with the existing state law already in place for processing uses not listed in the SMP. And another thing to note is that it determines standards in the SMP to be applied on a case-by-case basis, which can be problematic for the city when reviewing proposals. However, we do understand where this wording is coming from for the proposal, since the SMP does not contain standards for private marina facilities. And applying standards from other uses may result in restrictions to development of these types of facilities. So we are open to changes of the wording, and this is something to keep in mind as we go through alternative B. So alternative B is a staff proposed alternative to amend the footnote to read, other uses which are not classified or set forth in this chapter may be authorized as conditional uses, provided the applicant can demonstrate consistency with the requirements of the Revised Code of Washington 173-27-160 and the shoreline development standards contained in this chapter. This WAC section contains the criteria for conditional use permits. And if necessary, I can prepare some more detailed information on these criteria for the next meeting. But in short, any proposed conditional use permit would need to demonstrate consistency with the SMA, SMP, the city's comp plan, and show that the proposal does not result in any adverse impacts to the environment or to the public interest. This amendment would allow uses not classified to be authorized subject to certain standards, which is directly out of the Washington Administrative Code. The city has the option to reflect this with this proposed amendment. And as I said earlier, we're open to changes to the wording, specifically this last part where the applicant must demonstrate consistency with the shoreline development standards contained in the SMP. And I'll address the public comment we received regarding this wording a little bit later, and we can explore some options then. Alternative B would also amend MICC 1913-010E, which establishes the relationship between the SMP and other federal and state law. So the amendment would adopt by reference the shoreline management permit and enforcement procedures in existing state law under Chapter 173-27 WAC. This connection is not currently included in the SMP, which results in some uncertainty in how to process shoreline permits like conditional use permits and variances. So this amendment would provide this clarity. So the benefits to alternative B is that it would accomplish the same goal as alternative A for the beach club and other similar facilities, since they are not listed uses and would be allowed through a conditional use permit, but the language would be consistent with existing state law. And alternative B would provide flexibility in the application for shoreline use standards in a manner consistent with the Revised Code of Washington. And the Revised Code of Washington section listed in the second bullet point identifies use preferences for shorelines of the state. And the second part of this alternative would provide a clear path for processing the resulting conditional use permits by following procedures in state law, which are not currently identified in the SMP. The drawbacks to this alternative is that it would allow for uses not classified to be authorized and could result in proposed uses that the city has not yet considered. However, any proposed use that is not listed would need to go through the conditional use permit process set up by the state. So like I said before, this process is designed to ensure that there are no detrimental impacts to surrounding uses and that the proposal is consistent with the city's comprehensive plan, SMP, and state requirements. And alternative C would result in no changes to the SMP, which would maintain the prohibition on uses not listed in Table B for shoreline uses waterward of the ordinary high water mark. And the city is not required to make any amendments to the SMP. As I mentioned earlier, we received one public comment which suggested further revising the footnote in Table B to include both the language consistent with state law as shown in Alternative B and include the language to apply standards in the SMP on a case-by-case basis as shown in Alternative A. We are open to discussion on this, but would strongly recommend against using language that could result in preferential treatment, such as the phrase case-by-case. So staff recommends amending the footnote in MICC 1913-040 Table B and 1913-010E consistent with Alternative B, which would provide flexibility in the application of use regulations and would provide for clarity for processing shoreline permits. And then a little reminder, we'll be holding the joint public hearing with the Department of Ecology on March 22nd, where we will prepare and present the draft amendment based on your feedback today, and then hopefully get a recommendation to take for the initial determination of consistency to ecology, and then further to City Council. And now we have time for questions, and I would also like to request any feedback on the direction.
Thank you very much, Molly. I appreciate your detailed information. I see Commissioner Acuse is first, and then I think, Victor, you had a question, and then we'll go to Carolyn. So why don't you start, Kate?
Okay, I finally got the mute working. Yeah, I was wondering, we talked a lot about consistency, and I personally think there's a really much simpler solution to this rather than wordsmithing. I'm concerned, as Molly mentioned, about the potential for unintended consequences, and that leaving it sort of open-ended when really we're just talking about boating facilities. So there's a super elegant solution here, which is just adding the phrase boating facilities to the table and requiring conditional use permits. Actually, I think it's S cups, because the shoreline conditional use permit when you have a boating facility. I think it's really simple. We don't have to mince words. It's all covered by the WAC already. So that's my feedback. Add boating facilities.
Okay. Sorry, Laura, turn that on. Victor.
So my question was, we got this letter from the beach club, or a representative of the beach club. Are any of the options do any of the options presented reflect the concerns that are highlighted in that letter?
So that was not prepared for this presentation, but that is something that we would be open to exploring. Like I said, though, the wording of, case-by-case basis was included in that letter as a concern. So that's something that we would need to work through.
Okay, Carolyn.
Did I just understand you to say, Molly, that none of the options provided serve the interests and concern of the beach club and what they were trying to do? Or did I misunderstand that? In response to Victor's question.
So alternative A was the original proposal from the beach club that was
Mhm.
docketed. And then later we got the public comment from them that maybe would provide kind of a mesh of the two alternatives that were proposed.
Mhm.
So that would be something that we could explore.
So, okay, so you could explore, so that's the comment that they sent in that we had in our, received an email.
Correct.
You're talking about exploring what they're proposing as a possibility.
Correct.
Okay, but doesn't option B respond to their concerns and enable them to do the things they need to do, but also meet state law?
Yeah, so the public comment, they wanted to include the phrase case by case basis to not have the shoreline standards from the SMP regulate the use, because there are no shoreline standards for marina facilities like this. And I think that was their main concern.
Okay, because it would be my understanding also that you can't just do something on a case by case basis, but
Right.
so is the reason that, I mean, I'm sort of just a basic question here. Is the reason that they needed to do this because the types of upgrades they need to do are not on this list of things that can be done? Is that the reason? And what are, if so, what are the things they want to do that are not on the list?
So the reason that they wanted to include the, let me go back to their proposed. So all of the uses that are listed here, the private club and the overall use of the marina facility as a private club is not allowed as a use under the SMP currently. So if they wanted to redevelop their facilities and include these things as a private marina, they would not be allowed to do that.
So this table we were given in our packet, shoreland use waterward of the ordinary high water mark, that doesn't include the things that they want to do. That's the question I was asking, I think, more than what they've written in this paragraph here.
Yeah, it doesn't include private marina facilities as a,
Okay, private marina facilities. Okay. And I just want to mention the alternative B that was provided on the screen is different from the alternative B that we have in our packet. In our packet, the first sentence, a use not listed in this table is not permitted within shorelands, is not deleted? Or am I looking at the wrong thing? Yeah, that's not deleted in our packet. So I just want to make understand for sure. Alternative B deletes that first sentence.
correct. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. So this should be deleted here like this, right? Mhm.
So everything else, the text.
This should be crossed out then. Mhm.
Yep.
Okay, and okay, thank you.
Commissioner Murphy.
So Molly, can you elaborate a little bit on, if you can, on what the concern is with the supplemental language that the Beach Club memorandum suggested to append on to your language? Or have you guys looked at that yet?
Yeah, so basically at the end of this section, they would insert here and delete the shoreline development standards contained in this chapter for applying standards in the SMP on a case-by-case basis.
I didn't read, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Because that's not how I read their memo.
So the way I understood their revision was to add the shoreline development standards to be applied on a case-by-case basis, in addition to the language that's contained in the WAC.
Right, they had the very same language that you have in B, and then they added a proviso to cover
Right.
the situation of when the applicable shoreline development standards are not contained in this chapter, which is the case. And applicable development standards are then to be determined on a case-by-case basis. What I think they were concerned about was that the language that you were proposing ended up being circular and would put them having to comply with standards which were not intended. And so I think that's what they're trying to solve. Now, Kate's suggestion earlier might be a better solution to that problem as well. But I haven't really thought through that. So I think that there needs to be some further thought as to understanding what the beach club is concerned about, because I can see what they're concerned about, and figuring out if there's anything wrong with that proviso, or in the alternative, if there is a, as Kate proposed, a more elegant solution to this thing, without having to keep, crafting footnotes and adding provisos to footnotes.
If I could, I did speak with Gardner Morelli, the representative of the beach club, earlier this week. And prior to him sending in the public comment, he mentioned kind of what you were just saying, Commissioner Murphy, that their concern is this language about the shoreline development standards contained in this chapter would prevent them from moving forward because there are no standards currently for marinas or boating facilities. My response to that was that this section of the WAC includes, there's like a subsection 3 that talks about unlisted uses can be permitted through a conditional use permit. So the staff feeling was that this is not a problem. However, like Molly was saying, we're open to revising this language. I mean, perhaps a simple revision would be to add the word applicable in here. Any applicable shoreline development standards contained in this chapter. I think Commissioner Accuse's alternative proposal to add boating facilities to the chart could also work. However, it would not address this problem for other uses that aren't listed in the table.
Well, the original proposal was not intended to address other uses.
That's true.
So your language is actually broadening out the agenda here, whereas Kate's is more narrowly tailored to address what was the original goal. So I think some of those things need to be discussed. Your thought, Allison, about inserting the word applicable, that may solve it, but it may end up just continuing to be circular because, is the 4-foot width or the 6-foot width applicable, on the walkway.
The width, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure if that solves it, but I think, I think there may be other solutions. We just haven't figured them out yet, but if we want to broaden this out, I don't have a problem, but we're solving a problem. We're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist yet. And we know there's a problem that does exist. So it might be better to just cross that bridge when we come to it, if there's further problems on the road.
I would say that from the staff perspective, there's two problems here. One is the issue the beach club has brought up, which is that their use is not listed in the table. The second problem is that the one the staff have brought up, which is that the code does not provide any standards for reviewing SCUP applications. And so we need that reference to the WAC to be able to do that.
Oh, yeah, I concur with that. I agree with that part of it. That's an easy fix.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go to Commissioner Acus next, and then I think Commissioner Boatsman has something after that. I saw you turn your
She's
mic on, so I knew.
I'll shut it off.
Hi, I just wanted to address two comments that I heard. I heard a question about whether or not the MIBC facility would be allowed in shoreline permits. And I heard the answer from staff was no, but I just really wanted to clarify that that's just in the city shoreline. Master plan language, boating facilities are allowed by the state code. So it's not that they're not allowed. They actually are allowed by the state, just not the city. And then I heard another comment about whether the elements that MIBC is proposing are listed in the table. And as far as I can tell, reviewing the design, all of the elements presented in the draft design are noted in the table piers. I think this is a comment that Gardner made in a previous public comment. The problem is really just quantity. It's piers and docks and stuff like that. It's limited to 4 units, whereas they have a lot more slips in this facility. So the problem really is like the number allowed. And then just in terms of opinions, I agree that the MIBC proposal doesn't work because of case by case. I am really concerned about the unintended consequences of broadening the agenda. And so I think we do need to have that WAC reference. I appreciate that. My concern about just having the WAC reference and not putting boating facilities in the table is that we're all kind of wonky and can dive into code. I think it's a pretty deep dive for residents, to go into code and find vague language, like to try to wrap their heads around it. Whereas just adding boating facilities to the table, you've already got really specific do's and don'ts in the code for that. So I'd really like to keep this narrow if we can, just to protect the resource.
Okay, let me go to Carolyn, and then we'll go back to Mike.
Well, I had an initial something on my mind, but now I have other things on my mind. I want to address, it seems to me that the staff's proposal B kind of solves the issue for the beach club, but also for other proposals that may come up in the future. And I think it is a really good idea to come up with a change here that takes care of this problem, but also other things that may come up in the future, which we aren't anticipating right now. So I don't think it broadens, the issue in a destructive way that presents threats to the shorelands, because the staff's proposal ties this to, let's see, let me get out what it says here. Basically just broadly referring to other uses which are not classified or set forth in this chapter may be authorized as conditional uses. So the state law that they're tying us into here with the proposed language provides the conditional use permit to deal with those things that come up. So I don't really quite see the concern that the beach club has at this point in reading the staff's proposal. I think the staff's proposal does give them the flexibility to deal with the change they want to do. Am I missing something? Somebody help me. Allison? Am I missing something?
I don't think so. I actually agree with what you just said. However, I understand where the beach club's coming from, that the wording does seem on its face to cause a problem. It's just when you read into the WACs, there's a provision that allows for unlisted uses to be reviewed as a conditional use.
Yeah.
Now, someone earlier said, I think it was Commissioner Accused, that maybe this isn't very transparent when it's done that way. It's confusing. So that's why we're saying we're open to looking at this wording and trying to find a way to make this more clear.
Sure, I think changing the wording in some way that might, make people feel more comfortable is fine. But I think, essentially in your basics, you have a proposal in alternative B that addresses the real concerns in this issue.
I missed Victor and then we'll go to Mike. Go ahead.
So I think to address the question that you're asking, I think the beach club is being provided with the mechanism for solving this problem, but they're not being provided with the exact criteria by which they're going to be evaluated. Is that right? And so it's but for the conditional use permit, they have to evaluate it against certain standards, and I don't think those standards that have been dictated. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think that's generally correct. Our code does not provide like dimensional standards around like how wide the first 30 feet of your dock could be, for example, for this type of boating facility or marina. And so, I think as a part of the conditional use process, we would need to look at what's available in the state regulations. And then is there anything that's applicable in our code or that's similar that we might want to look at for guidance? And then that would all be considered through the SCUP process. There is something called a boating facility in the WAC that's allowed under state law. So perhaps we would want to look at those provisions. But, it's not like the same clarity you get from having the provisions right in our code.
I don't think they know how they're going to be evaluated. And if it doesn't go their way, then they are prevented from applying for 3 years. Is that right? For
They would be prevented
submitting
from
another docket.
Another docket request for this
Right.
issue.
So I think it's the vagueness around, they don't know how they're going to be evaluated. And if they're evaluated in an unfavorable way, they're prevented from submitting another request. And I think, as we heard in the docketing process, their situation is relatively dire.
Yes.
So,
The question I would have though is, does either of these alternatives solve that problem? I'm not sure that.
That was my first question.
Yeah.
That was my first question. This was in response to.
Yeah.
This was in response to.
Commissioner Murphy.
Just to follow up on the last docket item we had here, and my suggestion is to work with the beach club. If you're going to look seriously at this option of boating facilities as being an answer, a potential answer that might address the criteria issue that Victor's talking about, and the concerns that they had in their memo, it might be well worth the effort to engage with them to see what their view of that is, if that answers their concern, because the simpler and more clear we make this, the faster it will happen.
Excuse me. Adam, any questions from you or comments?
I'm just listening and absorbing. There was one comment.
That's Commissioner Curry's line. You can't use that.
I will say there was one comment about let's keep this very narrow and not try to solve a problem that might come later down the road. But that reminds me of what we were just looking at prior to this. So I would say let's not leave a known thing floating around for someone else to deal with in the near future.
Okay. Commissioner Curry, do you have any questions or comments?
I don't. I'm actually really am just trying to absorb all this. I was a little confused by some of the email, and then the presentation this morning. I was kind of having a hard time reconciling all of that together. So yeah, again, I'm kind of just listening right now to see how this is going to go. I don't have a bias either way. So,
okay. I'm going to summarize some, I think, broad themes and then give you some of my thoughts. So Molly and Allison, take notes as you see fit. Look, I think there are a couple of things that are very clear here, which is I see no indication that the community doesn't support us trying to find an answer for clubs like the Beach Club to be able to maintain and improve and essentially repair and or replace these sorts of facilities. They're heavily used. I think it's, if done appropriately and properly, all the mitigations are in place, or at least the regulations are in place to help mitigate any impacts from an environmental standpoint and those sorts of things. So I think I'm safe, I hope, to summarize that I think everybody is in favor of trying to find a solution for the Beach Club. At least I'll summarize the conversations I've had with members of the public, which is I think most people on the island belong to one of the, or certainly a high percentage of the population of the island belong to one of these clubs, or at least have used them. Then it gets to the question of how precise do we craft the language to rectify this. My personal belief is always to create a improve the tool or the process, and to never make it specific, because then we always have to go and fix or undo, or then go and have to go through this process every time there's some other case that comes up. If we find a mechanism that solves this problem, that is also going to create a mechanism that other people could use to solve similar problems, I'm in a big favor of that. So I think that's where alternative B gets us to. The question, I think, then parlayed to that is, does it actually go far enough to give the certainty to the club that they need to actually solve their problem? And so I'm hearing on one hand that the language may not be precise enough, that we think the mechanisms are there in the WAC, but it would take some research, and there would have to be some standards that would have to be discovered to figure out what a conditional use and a set of requirements would fit around, because there are no guidelines. Short of us actually taking the time to create a whole section of the shoreline development standards that address this particular use for the city, I'm not sure we're going to solve the problem either way, nor are we qualified to, which I would agree. So in that sense, I'm in favor of the language, the addition of the language around whether it be applicable shoreline development standards or something to that effect that creates that reference back to the WAC, where we can then broaden it to go discover other applicable standards. That's the direction that I go. But again, I think the big question mark here that we've heard from the club is that going to give them the certainty that they need without wasting a bunch of time to solve the problem? I think it does, but I also haven't read and done all the research around what those regulations are and how they would be applied and those sorts of things. So
yeah, that all makes sense. I think from the staff side, we need to go a little farther down the road to understand, if when the Beach Club applies for a conditional use permit, how will we actually evaluate that application? What standards can we pull in that would make sense? And then kind of work backwards from there to make sure this language works and provides the clarity and, the amount of specificity that's needed to make this workable.
is that a direction you can take by the next conversation?
Yes.
She says, well, shaking her head.
I will say yes for Molly. Molly's gonna have to do it. But we're gonna be working closely with Ryan Harriman, our planning manager, who I know has done some shoreline conditional use permit reviews in the past and can provide some insight on how this actually works, because I don't think either Molly or I have done one.
Well, it's good. Good learning opportunity.
Mhm.
So now we're having career growth conversations as a part of the planning commission. Is that the?
That's fantastic.
All right. So with that summary, I see Commissioner Acus raised her hand. Are there any other questions after I call on her that folks have? Okay, I'll go to, or comments, I should say. Kate, I'll go to you.
Yeah, just as you're going down that road, there is quite a bit in the Washington Administrative Code, just for folks who don't know what WAC means. There are quite a lot of things that could be allowed in shoreline. So I'd appreciate as part of the, I guess what we call the discovery phase, it sounds like in order to address mine and Vice Chair Murphy's concern that you could potentially be opening a little bit of a can of worms here, and that's the unintended consequence I'm concerned about. You know, shorelines management includes things like aquaculture. Pretty sure we don't want that on our shoreline, right? So I would want the staff to really evaluate what kinds of uses could be allowed in addition to boating facilities. And do we want to open, just so we can understand what door we're really opening if we leave it vague. Yeah. And can the staff also, and I don't know if this is part of what you just summarized, Chair, or not, can we ask staff to present the alternative of simply adding boating facilities to the table as an additional alternative? And that way we can weigh the pros and cons of that alternative against the language change alternative.
I would say if there's consensus from the commission to pursue that option, we can add it as an alternative for consideration.
Kate, my only hesitation in that is actually not understanding how much work is necessary beyond, like, just adding it to the table. Is that good enough with a statement of how it would be applied? I actually don't think it solves the problem. Like, I think we get to the same problem, which is they need to go do the research on what standards they would even use. By adding it to the table and saying it would be a conditional use, we're really still at the same place, which is what are the standards that would be applied to that? So even if you add it to the table, unless there's a reference that we have, it doesn't matter really
Yeah, I
how
think
we reference
we
it.
would have to reference the WAC provisions for boating facilities. You know, they've got a definition and some provisions around what's allowed. So
I would,
yeah,
maybe
that might
the
be
way I
possible.
would phrase it is, if it's easy enough to come back and actually provide us the background on what is actually a part of those provisions, and if those are good enough, then what's the best way to apply them to what we're trying to do? Is it through just adding it to the table, or is it just referencing it in the text? Ultimately, I think that's what we're getting to, which is what are the actual standards that get applied? That's the unknown piece.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is
that's-
your whole working backwards thing.
That's the part we need to research and understand which standards will apply, if any, and then how those need to be referenced here.
Kate, did I at all answer your question or reaffirm?
I just realized I was muted when I was trying to talk. In my opinion, it's a lot easier to put boating standards in the table. You know exactly what's allowed and not allowed because it's described in the WAC, and it's easy for staff to grab that. It's much harder for them to say, what are the entire range of possibilities of every proposal that could ever come to us, and comb the WAC, every kind of different category beyond boating facilities. You know, that's a much more vague ask of staff. It's the ask, and I only say this because I've read the WAC and I work in shorelines, that it's very specific, and I'm very concerned. I share the concern with the beach club that you're just leaving some what feels like to the public arbitrary decision making to staff. And they're very frustrated by that. They really didn't understand the code as written, and why, because it says piers and moorings and stuff like that, they couldn't just use that, because all of the elements of their proposal are already in our code. It's just the quantity was missing. And so I think just the clearer we can be about exactly what they're dealing with, and again, I don't think it's a big ask for staff to write down the provisions. It's a copy and paste exercise, really, because the boating facilities standards are already outlined. Am I beating a dead horse? I'm going to stop now.
No, I think we're saying the same thing, and I'm just looking at Allison. I think we're on the.
Yeah, so I guess my only question is, do we have consensus from the commission that you'd like us to develop another alternative related to adding boating facilities as a conditional use?
I'm just looking for some like thumbs up if people are okay with that exercise being done. I mean, ultimately, getting to your working backwards.
Yeah.
If that's the way that it's going to be better to address the underlying need of just being a little bit more specific about the regulations that do apply,
Yeah.
then great, let's do it.
Yeah.
And if that's not the best way, then let's do it another way.
I don't think it's a lot of additional work beyond what we were already saying we were going to do. It's just, I want to know now if everyone thinks it's a terrible idea, because then we won't.
Why
spend
don't
time on
we,
it.
Victor?
I have no idea whether it's a terrible idea or not. Number one, I don't know what the work involved is. I'm supportive of providing them with the clarity they need.
Mhm.
And I think going back to what you originally said is, let's figure out what is the clarity that they need and work back from there. If it's, working another proposal, fine. If it's just modifying this one, that's fine too.
Okay.
I'm not as concerned about the process as I am balancing both staff work plus providing the applicant what they need to get their
Okay.
problem
Can
solved.
I ask it a different way? Do any of the commissioners have a feeling at this point in time about whether you prefer a narrow approach or a broad approach? Kind of what Kate and Mike were getting at in terms of, do we want to just allow this use for boating facilities? Or do we want to do a bigger fix that addresses any unlisted use?
I'll start here.
My preference is narrow fix.
Okay.
Broad, it takes time. And again, I think I considering they've paid the fee, we're doing this because of the beach club. I think we should optimize for the beach club.
Carolyn.
Well, I think you need to take a broad look at how the WAC would provide guidance for a conditional use permit in order to decide whether the most elegant solution is broad language in our code or narrow language, such as just adding boating. So I really think, you need to take the broad look, narrow it down, work backwards. And I'm sure you'll let us know if it's better to just add the word boating to a table. So
That's exactly what Allison doesn't want to hear.
Well, I don't understand. What do you mean?
Oh, just basically, you just said, go figure it out.
You tell me.
I mean, we really
That's
don't
okay,
know if a narrow solution would work. So I'm afraid, I'm not quite sure what we're going over here. I think.
It is a little chicken and egg. Kate, I saw your hand, and then I think I know what you're going to say. You're still on mute.
Never tell a woman, you know what she's going to say.
Oh.
So anyhow, I don't think we have the information to make that decision, because I think what I'm saying, and I don't want to speak for Victor, but I think what I hear him saying is that what narrow or broad is conflated with, does the beach club and the other clubs that have marinas around the lake, do they get the specificity they need? And those might be in opposition to each other. So I think as you're looking at it, I think, I always want to put things in a little matrix. You've got these different alternatives, and is it narrow? Is it broad? Does it give the boat club the clarity they need? These are different criteria that we would use to evaluate the goodness or badness of a proposal. So I think it's the conflation that's kind of like getting in my craw a little bit.
Adam, broad or narrow? I'm sorry, I'm just restating the question.
I'm gonna dance on the fence on that one. I was gonna ask, the question is, can we have the broad look, but kind of I appreciate Kate's concern about opening it up to unintended state approved uses. Is there a way we can have language in a solution, in a proposal that comes back, that articulates clearly that, we're looking at existing uses, not, we're not trying to make it, we don't want to open up the possibility of a new use coming on, and maybe we keep it narrow by just stating that this is a process for if someone needs to improve an existing use. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's something I was thinking. That would, I would think, cover our base on not getting new uses, but allow existing ones to get updated.
Yeah. Let me go to Commissioner
Sure.
Curry and Commissioner Murphy. Do
Mhm.
either of you have any comments to the question, broad or narrow?
I don't, I see both ways, right? I don't know. I'm on the fence. I don't know which way to lean, to be quite honest.
Commissioner Murphy?
Yeah, I would tend toward the narrow, just because if we make it too broad, we open up Pandora's box and start down different paths. I don't know if the boating facilities is the answer, or whether just, clarifying language in what we've been working on so far and integrating the beach club's comments in some fashion. So I would tend toward the narrow, just to avoid creating unintended consequences.
Before I go back to Carolyn, I'll just state my comment, which is generally I'm in favor of the broader tools and methods that we can use. In the case of this, Victor, actually, to me, I had the most salient point that sort of changes my view on this, which is, there's a very specific proposal in front of us for a specific reason with some specific things that need to be achieved. And if there's anything that's going to jeopardize the ability to react to that quickly, I would say they need to be jettisoned, and we need to just stay focused and that quote the task at hand on that. And as much as I would love some elegant, broad solution, I'm not sure it warrants taking the extra time to do that, especially if there's a bunch of unintended consequences. I hear a bunch of on the fences, and then several, let's just keep it narrow. So I think let's do our best to keep it as narrow as possible. And if there are places that we need to broaden it in order to make it effective in the way that it works, I think we should maybe we can include those, but does that help at all?
Yeah, that does. I think I appreciate the sentiment to, keep it simple and just get this done. I think that's important to keep in mind. I think as staff, we tend to see all the problems that we want to fix and like, hey, this is a great opportunity. Let's just take care of it. But sometimes that does cause unintended consequences or makes things take longer, more complicated than you initially thought. So I definitely appreciate that.
Okay,
Um,
Carolyn, it looked like you had one last comment
Yeah,
before we move
my
on.
previous comment, I perhaps didn't really quite address the broadness of the actual language that's proposed by the staff and why I favor that. I mean, today it's the beach club, they're coming in and saying they need to upgrade their boating facilities. Maybe in a few years, it'll be the shore club, and maybe Covenant Shores will have some issues. And, we must address what the beach club is asking us to address. However, the underlying problem that they have is that our language is too narrow. So the solution to their problem is to add the obvious caveat that if you're not in this list that's in the code of shoreline uses waterward of the ordinary high water mark, if you're not in that list, they may be authorized as a conditional use permit, provided the applicant can demonstrate consistency with the requirements of the state law. So I just think that's just too valuable of an opportunity to miss when this look how much time we're spending on this. The staff is spending time on it. This is not dangerous language. This is really good. So I really think, yes, we must address the narrow issue of beach club's concerns, but this is a great solution that's really valuable to the future. We won't have things like B zones with no development standards to address them. This is one of those great opportunities to fix something. So I would ask everyone to consider that possibility.
Okay. I was just gonna say, do you have enough indecision to move forward?
I think we've got enough dialogue here to put together some analysis around a couple of options to bring to the public hearing next month, and then we can talk about it some more.
I just envision you listening to these meetings on your way to and from work, like a podcast, trying to decipher what did they say?
Sometimes I do go back to them, not in my car, but at my desk, like, wait, what did they actually tell us to do? And it's not always as clear as you thought.
It's likely never as clear as we think it is. Okay. All right. If we are done with that, anything else, Allison, you have related to this other than you'll have something for the hearing on next month?
March 22nd, we'll be back. Yes.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for the dialogue. Molly, thank you for walking us through this, and welcome to the team, the Planning Commission evening group.
Thank you.
With that, Deputy Director's report. Allison, do you have anything this evening?
I was going to pull up a slide deck that I did for City Council last night, but that feels like a bit much right now. So I'm just going to talk to you off the top of my head and try to tell you the same information in a shorter time frame. I just wanted to give a brief update about where things are at with the comp plan, since we're kind of on hiatus from that with the commission at the moment. But there are a few things still happening in the background, and things will be eventually heading back your direction. So I think many of you are aware there's a bunch of new requirements coming down for the housing element from HB 1220 and new guidance that's coming out from the Department of Commerce. Draft guidance, there's 3 different documents that are now available. They haven't been finalized yet. We're anticipating that the final guidance will be available here in the next couple, 2-3 months. We're also still waiting on the affordable housing needs allocation from King County. That will be sort of the targets that we need to plan for different income bands of affordable housing. So once those 2 pieces of information are finalized, we're going to be amending the scope of work that City Council approved last year to expand all of the activities we'll be doing around the housing element. We need to do a racially disparate impacts analysis and a land capacity analysis that looks at if we have enough capacity for those affordable housing needs at each income band. And so that's going to be a bunch of additional work that we didn't foresee quite what the depth and breadth of it would be. So the housing work group remains on hold at the moment. Once we kind of restart this work and have some additional analysis, like on the racially disparate impacts, we will be firing that work group back up, probably sometime late spring, early summer, I would guess. The economic development work group has been working hard kind of throughout the winter, reviewing draft goals and policies for that element. They've completed their initial go through of that, and next we'll be starting to work on drafting the full element. That will then come back to the Planning Commission for the Planning Commission's review of the draft element, also likely later in the spring or early summer. Let's see. The third thing is the parks zone. Part of the scope of work that the city council approved for the comp plan was to create a new parks zone, both incorporating some goals and policies into the land use element and then actually adopting the development regulations for the zone. So staff are starting work to draft those development regulations. We'll be taking them to the Parks and Recreation Commission in April for their input. And then they'll be sending that input over to the Planning Commission for your review, beginning in the May or June timeframe. So where does that leave the Planning Commission? You've completed review of 4 elements, believe it or not: land use, transportation, utilities, and capital facilities. Like I said, economic development will be coming back soon, and then eventually housing will be coming to you probably next fall. Those are all of the elements. So there's really just 2 to go. However, I think we will have to loop back for another round with the land use element, because that will need to incorporate the changes from the housing element, the climate action plan, the park zone. It needs to be consistent with all of those things. And so I think some additional changes to the land use element will likely be needed. The aim is to have all of the draft elements done either end of this year, beginning of next year, and then they will go through an extensive community outreach review, and eventually a recommendation will go to the city council for their review. So that's all I've got for that update. Are there any questions about how all that's going? Okay, hearing none. Like we've said a few times, our next meeting is March 22nd. We're going to have 2 public hearings then. And in April, we may or may not be continuing one or more of the items we talked about tonight, just kind of depending on how they go. And, you know, we'll be kind of rolling back into comp plan work after that. That's all I've
Allison,
got.
with the public hearings, we'll be covering those 2 the 2 topics this evening. I'm assuming there will be discussion then, like the entirety of the meeting will be the public hearings, and then discussion from the public hearings providing additional updates potentially for a final action in April. Is that the,
Yeah,
or are
so
we
the-
looking for final action on the next meeting? in
It could
March?
be done either way. I think, you know, particularly with the beach club situation, there's some urgency. So if it's possible to get it to a recommendation next month, that would probably be good for them. It would help us, you know, get to the next stage, which is the Department of Ecology needs to review the draft and essentially approve it before we can continue. So, you know, we're doing a bunch of analysis between now and then. We'll do the best we can to give you some solid recommendations and options to consider. You know, we'll just have to see whether or not you're at a place where you feel like, yep, we've got what we need. We can just go ahead and recommend this, or if we'll need a little more time to further refine something and bring it back in April.
Okay. All right. Any questions for Allison around the meeting schedule or anything else? Any known absences that we should account for on the 22nd? Okay, if something comes up, please reach out to the clerk and Allison and let them know. And otherwise, if anyone has anything for the good of the order, I'll entertain it now. And if not, we will adjourn. Thank you all very much. See you next month.